Hi, everyone. Welcome to All Free, a podcast for collective liberation.
Feeling the momentum of other people realizing that our liberation is interconnected, that our joy is interconnected, that this is not about being saviors or even allies. This is like what we are all working towards for our mutual liberation.
It's really false notion that the state can provide safety at the helm of other people's lives, as if safety could ever come from harming other people.
For us to be free, everyone must be free.
I'm playing different role and Hannah's playing different role. Deema is playing different role. That it's all contributing into the better world that we wish to see for our children and the future generations.
Hello and welcome. I am your co-host, Hannah.
And I am your other co-host, Deema. We're thrilled to have Catherine Brinkley on the show today. Catherine is a professor of community development. Like urban planning, community development is a process where community members take collective action to address issues and improve their lives, often involving grassroots work and emphasizing social equity, economic opportunity, and sustainability. With a veterinary medical degree and a PhD in urban planning, Catherine, you've been very busy. Catherine is focused on land reform to achieve One Health, a principle that considers the connections between human, animal, and environmental health. She currently works at the University of California, Davis, which is one of the reasons why I know Catherine so well, the nation's leading agricultural research institute. Her land and food systems research bridges rural and urban communities and has received a National Science Foundation Career Award for research involving mapping social networks and creating novel public data sets to inform democracy at a local level. Catherine, you are like so impressive on paper, but I also just know you personally, and you are just an impressive human being. I love knowing you. I am so thrilled that you are joining us to give us some of your thoughts around collective liberation, around local movements, around how people can get involved. I'm going to start by sort of asking you something about that just happened very recently, and you and I were both part of it. We both attended I think it was the Davis Faculty Association on UC Davis campus put on a visual and a rally really around sort of the current attacks on academic institutions in the US. And there were many different themes that were brought up in the talks that happened. I'm curious sort of what you took away from it, what you're currently kind of feeling as someone who your life is on campus, your life is with students, and there's quite a lot of pressure on campuses right now.
There absolutely is. I walked away from that feeling very heartened that there were so many faculty and community members who came out, who are recognizing the crisis right now. Our federal government is withholding grant funding. It's laying off federal workers who are in agencies that we regularly communicate with, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Housing and Urban, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And then there are threats to funding students. So Project 2025 lays out a blueprint for knocking the wind out of higher education. And the reason they would want to do that is because higher education is where the next generation gets set up for success. And if you want to control, the next generation, then you need to knock out the universities. So that's what we're facing. I really hope that the public sees how research and development is critical to our economy. I really hope that they see how this is impacting the future of the U.S. and the world. I mean, to withhold funding at the nation's leading ag research institute means it's going to have ripple effects across the food system globally. So it's kind of terrifying what could happen if not countered. And it's really heartening when people take time out of their day to get civically involved and challenging.
I felt also heartened to see people there. There were people who seem to be coming from different angles around why this is important to them, which is great. It was interesting to me that some of the speakers really did bring that about. Some people are here because they're worried about science funding. Some people are here
Mm,
because they're worried about students being silenced. Um,
hmm
and I am curious your thoughts on that. Do you think, so one of the speakers, who I think was an organizer, noted that they had been asked to perhaps remove any mention of Mahmoud Khalil,
mm, hmm
and the Palestine Liberation Movement, and what has happened on campuses around bringing attention to that. And they chose not to avoid that. They felt it
Yep.
was very important too. I was curious if you thought more people would have shown up had that been not there,
Mm.
and what your thoughts are around that in general.
Yeah. Well, let me just paint a picture for the listeners right now. So, UC Davis has a big quad, a big green space, and that's usually where protests and demonstrations happen. That's where the encampment to support Gaza and Palestine was located. And so it is the hub, the heart of our campus, really. So structurally, it's a space. I also have to say, historically, our campus was the campus where students were pepper sprayed for demonstrating, and most of those students were community development students. So we have students that are not afraid of weighing in on controversial issues. Another bit of history is that if you want to build a movement, like a liberation movement, or you want to speak to power, typically you build from the last movement that had momentum. And that last movement across universities was the encampments, really. So the organizers of the Davis faculty group decided not to shy away from that, to invite the momentum and energy from that movement into this moment. And faculty were encouraged to show up in their full regalia. We look like a bunch of wizards, which is a little bit ridiculous and kind of funny in a way, with our hats and our velvet robes. And then there were people who came and wanted to disrupt because they really wanted the organizers to address the Israeli hostages or to talk about Hamas in that moment. And there was just a really beautiful moment when a community member, she's 82 years old, she's 5'1", and there was a heckler out front who was interrupting the speech that Deema was talking about and yelling and disrupting and making it difficult to hear. And this little 82-year-old used all 5'1" of her body to walk over to this guy and wrap him in a big hug. And it took a lot for her to do that because they don't share similar views. And it disarmed him. And I know he's acting out because he's afraid and he's anxious. And she just wrapped him in love. And then she kept her arm in the crook of his arm for the rest of the time. And he didn't say anything else. And it was so beautiful to see, to have that moment. And we wouldn't have had that moment had the organizers somehow decided that they were going to sidestep the issue that youth care most about right now on campuses. So I think to not have included the unlawful arrest and to try and downplay that would create an elephant in the room type atmosphere. It wouldn't create the space for working across interest groups. So I think it was clever of them. Would more people have come? I don't know.
Yeah, it was a beautiful moment. I'm glad you brought that one up. I was kind of blown away to see her. Uh, she was obviously a supporter of Mahmoud Halil, it seems, and the Palestine movement based on like the sign that she was holding. And it just, I think it caught him off guard, and yet
Mhm.
also the heckling stopped. So
It
that was
did. My
amazing.
Wow.
my 14-year-old son, so this is praise from a teenager. He thinks that she's the baddest boss bitch in all of Davis. I think he's right. When a
Did not have,
14-year-old is singing the praises of an 82-year-old,
It's a
I
big
mean, that's
deal.
some powerful intergenerational
yeah.
action building.
Absolutely. Yeah, you touched on something that I've been thinking about a lot, and even in the decision making around whether to include Mahmoud Khalil in some of the messaging on this demonstration. It's like when we make any sort of concessions of standing in our own integrity, like when we start to self-censor and we start to appease, I think we obviously lose the opportunity to have incredible moments like that, but we also lose some of the momentum and some of our own like internal peace when we do stuff like that because we're out of alignment with our own integrity. So yeah, I'm glad that you said that. I think that people are obviously, and you've painted the picture of what's at stake. People are freaked out. People are anxious. A lot of people who maybe don't have a background in any sort of activism or really any sort of community engagement are maybe feeling a little confused of even if I get involved, is it high risk? Where should I start? And usually we would have calls to action at like the end of the episode, but I wanted to start here because I'd love to know your perspective as a community organizer and someone who has studied movements as well. Like, if someone is feeling like this is a sign of things to come, and if they don't speak up now, it's going to be harder to speak up in 6 months, what would you advise somebody like that do?
There are some really excellent studies that show that most people get introduced to social activism at universities. It makes sense. And that you're more likely to be even more involved later if you take that first step. So I would say just take the first step and do what you feel comfortable. If you don't feel comfortable holding a sign, don't hold a sign, but show up to, there's so many demonstrations right now. Show up to one of them. You build solidarity, you make friends at these movements. They're as much for the movement building as they are to speak to power. And I think that's tricky right now too, because a lot of people are saying, oh, I don't want to get involved because I don't think it'll matter. And Deema and I both are involved in city politics and sit on commissions, and that work is often tedious. It's long hours. We both, we both made our entry into local Davis work at the same time, and it it's almost like I want to call it sacred civics, which is a book by a colleague of mine and Julian Aguiman, and he would say you have to practice it regularly. You have to show up. You have to show up to those city council meetings. That's a really low threshold. But once you do, and you take a look around the room, you feel more comfortable. You learn how to do that 2-minute public comment. I mean, we've had our kids stand up and do 2-minute public comments, so they're primed. But a lot of parents don't introduce their children to civic engagement, and so it feels scary. And then people just they think that you do the ballot, and almost half of Americans don't vote too. So there's that. So we're not building the sacred civic practice. We're not making it a regular practice. And if we all did and more people were engaged, you'd have better representation. Along those lines, I teach an intro to community studies class, and I also teach a local government class at UC Davis. And as part of that class, students are introduced to the history of the civil rights movement and the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins. Not everybody agreed that that was the way to go. So I think it's important to hold that in mind too, that in any movement, there has always been disagreement about the best way to move forward. That's not new. And it was students who were at Fisk University who were organizing, and that momentum helped build momentum, state to state, as well as a strategy around desegregating interstate transportation, desegregating restaurants elsewhere, desegregating space broadly. So students starting somewhere can lead to change elsewhere. It's a stepwise process. If you don't take that first step, there's no way you're going to take the steps 20 paces down the road.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people taking that first step is the the most intimidating. And for some people, they might be saying, okay, going to a city council or going to a protest isn't the best use of my skills for the movement.
Yeah.
And to those people, I would say, okay, well, you're going to find the people to connect with so that you can use your skills at that protest, though, or at that city council. You're going to find the partners and the people who are gonna get you plugged in and involved. And I love what you said about there being disagreements in every movement. I think when we look back on things, or when we have a very surface level view of a historical movement, we tend to think, okay, they all kind of agreed on it. They had strong leaders. Everyone like agreed with the leaders, and then they went and did stuff. And well, there's so much disagreement in the US about how to confront these violations of the First Amendment, and also how to confront the United States' continued support for Israel. And I think it's disheartening for people who don't know that that's normal, that that's to be expected.
Right, which is another reason that universities are being attacked, is because we are the bedrock of critical thinking. If you don't want people to think critically, you turn off the training for that, which is going to impact our ability to problem solve everything. I mean, the big ones, the climate crisis, rise of fascism, how to basic things like how to run a city, how to run public transit, how to solve poverty and a rise in the cost of goods and rise in folks who are facing homelessness. All those things require critical thinking and problem solving. So, and each of us can get involved even if we're not at the university, and have the luxury of thinking critically in a classroom with some guided reading.
How can people effectively engage if they're in some of these districts that maybe there's no university, maybe there's maybe there's still some protests going on, but maybe there's not even a strong protest presence?
You can always find your affinity group just by showing up. I mean, there are nonprofit groups all across the world who are working on freedom and liberation, and not just Palestine and preventing genocide, but also, I mean, there's local chapters of the United Nations almost in every city too. So if you think about some of the peacekeeping that the United Nations has done, or the Human Declaration of Independence, of Human Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, which there's groups that are working on sustainable development goals everywhere. There's ways to get involved even in your own workplace. They often say the first part is trying to have those conversations. And then think about that 82-year-old when you're faced with a person who is just so fearful that their reaction is to disrupt and get angry. Training yourself in nonviolence so that you react with love is not easy. It does not come natural. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the Civil Rights, they had active training sessions for how to be nonviolent. It's hard work.
Yeah, it's hard work. I think that both of you are making a really great point about just taking that first step. Like, it might not even be the organization that is right for you, but you go and you're going to meet someone who knows about another organization that you're like, oh, that's more my style, or that's more my speed. Because a lot of these groups are interconnected, and they are speaking with one another and working with one another. And people have slightly different kind of approaches or angles, but they're all connected. And so it just doing that first step connects you to a much broader group of people that you can then sort of find, the home that makes the most sense for you in this movement. And it will offer you different ways of being involved in case, you're not about going to protests. There are so many other ways to be involved. So I'm glad you both brought up that point, that it's that first step. So, yeah.
And not everyone has to lead the charge either. I mean, again, just civil rights. I think of Bayard Rustin's legacy. He was charged with making sure there were enough porta potties, and that there was cleanup after the marches, and that seems like not a very important piece. But if you do a march and you've just trashed the place, that does not look good for your cause. So there's always people that maybe are not the extroverts or the or the helpers behind the scenes that have a huge impact as well. And don't get celebrated as often as they should.
It's so true. I mean, even food and making sure that people are hydrated
Food.
and like these are all roles
Mhm.
that end up, I mean, like these are all real things that have to happen and someone takes that on, you know? It's all the backdrop
Yes.
stuff. Um, I feel like there was a good segue there to talk about the role perhaps because one of the places I have seen some of the activists coming out of is actually in our sort of like local churches. They are people who
Mm,
are like interested in understanding what's happening. They're doing book clubs and watching documentaries to try to understand what's happening. And then, you know, they're showing up, some of these folks from churches or interfaith groups, they're showing up and becoming active parts of various movements. And I'm curious, Catherine, because you have, I think, studied this, but also may have some personal background that can help us think about how does religion potentially play a
mhm,
role in movements and in what we're
mhm.
seeing right now with this major shifts in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question, Deema. I've been thinking about this a lot because I was just speaking yesterday with a student who's thinking about community development and faith-based organizations. And she's specifically thinking about Christianity. I'm the child of a military chaplain, and so I grew up moving all the time, seeing a bunch of different churches, and often the chapel space and on a military base is also the synagogue, is also the mosque. You just, you literally change the decor. And so it was a very interfaith upbringing that I adored. Um, anyway, this student was really wrestling with, so community development is all about empowering people to take action for themselves and to center the most vulnerable so that they can explain what their needs are, and then those needs can be met in a way that they find most helpful. That's a little bit different than the way that a lot of faith-based communities tackle issues like poverty, where there's a lot of emphasis on, yes, helping, but not necessarily centering the most vulnerable and giving them what they need, but just providing something. So I think for a lot of faith-based communities, there's a learning moment right now. There's also a reaching across, I mean, specifically the Abrahamic faiths right now are grappling with Israel Palestine, with pressures on how to support their, you know, closely allied faith groups. And there's also a splintering. I mean, there's a very real splintering happening too. And we've heard national pundits talk about the US like a white Christian nation, which has a very specific bent to it, where instead of focusing on centering the most vulnerable and helping them, there's a vetting process of who deserves that help and who is part of this nation, uh, or not. I mean, that's the rhetoric, really. So there's a lot of grappling with what is that? What if you are a Christian? What does that mean that there's a white nationalist Christian movement in the highest offices that is sending folks over to Germany to stir up neo-Nazism? What do you do with that? How do you speak out against that? Or in some churches, there's a celebration of that. So, if everyone's reading the same text, but everyone's interpreting it differently, what does that mean for a shared religion? Because religion is supposed to be all about value setting, which is different from how science operates. Science is a very process oriented. Religion sets the values, and science is, well, if that was where you wanted to go, here's how we could get there quickly or slowly or sustainably. That's a long answer, Dima. It's a hard question though, I think, because everyone has
It
to
is.
grapple with their faith and their value system, which is, people don't like to grapple with their deep innermost values.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I do think that in some circles, people are wanting to find, because I do think that, like I mentioned, in some circles, this is bringing people into the movement. Like religion is, in some ways, they feel a calling. They feel a calling to fight for justice and to be present and
Mhm.
to be working on things. In some cases, what I'm hearing is a dissatisfaction with religion, it not being able to allow them. I mean, I'm definitely hearing that, especially within the Jewish community. I mean, there's many who are feeling like they can't participate in a lot of what they want to participate in because they feel like their faith is being connected to atrocities that they don't agree with.
Mhm.
But I'm also seeing that in other groups as well, just feeling like the almost wanting a new type of religion, whether it's in their faith. So I've heard people say, "I want a new type of, or a Judaism that can be more about collective liberation." And then I've heard people also in the Christian religion saying, like, "I wish there was more," and also even in the Muslim, like, "I wish there was something just a little different about what religion can offer me." And I'm curious your thoughts on that, this like evolution of religion, potentially new religions forming. I think we're at this critical moment where we're seeing that happen a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you just take a really long historic view, which I have been thinking about a lot lately, because I've been trying to trace the history of the sciences and city planning in particular back thousands of years, and then spin it forward to see where we may have flaws in the bedrock of our thinking. Um, I mean, one of the big problems I have with the New Testament in particular is that women are half the population, right? But in a lot of the texts and in a lot of the religious spaces, women have had to fight very hard to lead in religious spaces. And if you just look New Testament to Old Testament, there are fewer women in the New Testament and fewer speaking roles for them. They talk less, they're not mentioned as often. And the way that that gets operationalized is a little girl listening to the word of God and not being represented, not feeling like, I mean, the parts that speak to half the population tell them that they're inherently sinful. The reason for mankind's downfall. Uh,
Mhm.
Not particularly heartening stuff. And it, I mean, it's that's a thorn that's embedded deep in every woman's consciousness. And it has taken a long time for me to imagine what it might be like to have been brought up in a different religion, especially I went to back to Greece, um, thinking about philosophy and Western philosophy, and I walked in Athens, and you can just see the Parthenon where these giant goddess statues, and then realizing that half the deities are female. It was just mind blowing to me. It was mind blowing to show my daughter these giant goddess statues too, and just, I mean, she doesn't get it. She doesn't have the same perspective of being told she's a inherently a sinner and the cause of the downfall of humanity from the pulpit. But I mean, talk about an internal value shift there. And I think I mean, there's a lot of women that are wanting that. There's a lot of women that are struggling with what their role is. There's a lot of women that are fighting to take away women's rights, which is always fascinating to look at women in high levels of office who are arguing that women shouldn't have the right to decide over their body, that they shouldn't have birth control. It's mystifying, honestly. Um, and then on the flip side, I think there's a hunger for a different value system. And there's a lot of evidence from a lot of different cultures where the generative life-giving force of women, that creativity and nurturing is centered, and it spins up an entirely different value system with entirely different attending philosophies about how to do civics, about how to structure space, about how to plan cities. And that is powerful and very interesting to me.
It's interesting. Sometimes when we address like the surface level of manifestations of oppression, we miss the way that some of these undercurrents has really designed our entire lives. And unless we're addressing that, like we're always going to be managing symptoms. And I see some of the like Christian patriarchy playing a role in this, and just the dominance and the Western centricism within what Christianity has turned into. I was talking to Deema the other day about Christian Zionism, and I'm like, I don't know if you can address Christian Zionism without liberating evangelicals. Like, can you? Because Christian Zionism is a manifestation of Christian violence, which comes from doctrine as Christianity was adopted into empire. It comes from Christian patriarchy. Like, all of these things are interconnected. So yes, you can get maybe some Christians to say, okay, we don't support genocide, but if we're gonna actually address some of these manifestations of a very, like, what I think is a very unhealthy and sick form of Christianity that has manifested in the U.S., it's like you have to address that at the root of it.
Yes, I agree. And there's been a lot of really fascinating anthropological work over the years that has tied the rise of patriarchy to shifts in religious thinking, to shifts in symbology, and has made the argument that if you didn't have sexism as the bedrock of all divisions, you would have a really hard time making logical sense of any other form of oppression.
Wow. Yeah. There's some root issues with that kind of supremacy. It's yeah, I think that's a really good point. I am curious because we talk about in on the podcast a lot. We talk about obviously about collective liberation because that's what the podcast is about. But as part of that, we often talk about how while it's not popular in certain spaces to talk about freeing the oppressor of their own fear, of their own hate, of their own dogma and doctrine, that can for some people who are, especially those who are actively being oppressed, it's like I'm not. They're feeling like I'm not interested in in helping them free themselves. But I think we know, as we talk about it more from a sort of like big picture standpoint, that is such an important part of this from an overall, like if we really want to reach our goal of collective liberation, it isn't only about liberating those who are oppressed, but it's about making the population that is the oppressor or is this in the supremacist state, that they are indoctrinated and they need to be freed from that indoctrination. I'm curious, Catherine, how you feel all of these things that we've talked about, how that plays into collective liberation in your mind, and what things could happen for us to help free those people so that we can move forward toward a world of collective liberation.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to go about it. It's not where I would start, though. I wouldn't start with trying to liberate the oppressor. I really wanted to read this quote from Frederick Douglass that I've been thinking about a lot. His quote, "Power concedes nothing without demand," right? We all know that quote, and he says it never did and it never will. But then there's the second part of it that we don't pay as much attention to. So he said, "Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you've found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And this will continue until it's resisted, with either words or blows or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those they impress." And he said this in 1857. This is before the Civil War. This is a man who escaped slavery. He's an abolitionist who was working with feminists on women's right to vote. They didn't get it, for a while. I think about that a lot because right now we are tolerating so much, and we are quiet, and we should be pitching a fit. And we're not. We're just, folks are just going about their day to day. They're thinking about, well, maybe I'll go to that protest. Maybe I won't. Or maybe a protest isn't for me. And we're dithering at a time when rights are being vanished, and
Yeah.
the rule of law about how Congress is supposed to manage the various agencies is not being followed. So the collective outrage, I think people have it. I think we're just we're not tapping it as much as we could. So to anyway, I think the first part is standing up for and articulating, what you do so well, Deema, the rights that are being violated. And until people can articulate that, showing the oppressors how they could be hugged and loved and, sat down with for tea, and uh, that is a much later step.
I think when people think about like resistance, sometimes they think that isn't loving towards like all. So sometimes people are like, okay, if I want to be loving, that means I just have to sit back and send the good vibes and send love to everybody. But if somebody is in the role of the oppressor, their humanity is being diminished, their dignity is being diminished. It is the most loving thing to do to somebody who is oppressing another person or oppressing you, to resist. Because resistance, and especially when you're not using the tools. So like the hug was an example of like a tool that diffuses the oppressor. When you're not using the oppressor's tools, and you demonstrate the absurdity of whatever kind of belief systems validate their continued oppression, that frees the oppressor. Like that's liberating of both.
That is love. I mean, I do see it as like needing to have all these things happening. It's not so much, and I think everybody's going to play a different role. We talk a lot about how it's not going to be necessarily my role to help people deal with their trauma, but someone is going to, and that's going to be their role. And like we've said, there's so many different ways people can get involved, and there are a lot of trauma therapists really weighing in right now on a lot of what's happening, and I think that's a perfect role for them. But I love that you brought up, Hannah, love, because one of the things that those of us who've been in the collective liberation movement, who've been in the Palestinian liberation movement, get thrown at us is that we hate America, right? And that is just such it's to cut us down and sort of end conversation. But I actually I wrote a poem, and I was telling Hannah that the poem was it's America, when will you stop? I think it's like America, when will you stop hating me? I have, or something like that. I can't remember the title, but I decided I want to change the title to a love letter to America, because it's basically all of these things that people are bringing up. And then I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of people, when we bring up our issues with what are happening, is because we actually love America and we want America to be a better place. And I know that that can be triggering for some people right now because they're very upset with what's going on. But I do think when we call a lot of these things out, we're calling it out as a desire for either our country or the people that we're with to be the best versions of themselves. And that's where love plays a
I
role.
Yeah, I empathize with that, Deema, too, because I see a lot of, I mean, there was a protest this past week from veterans. I mean, talk about people who sacrificed, they've lost friends, and they're not happy right now with the turn of events. So that's another powerful demonstration of love and calling out. I also think that right now when you're working with folks on the liberation movement, it can be really tricky to think about when to call out and when to call in. And I know you all have grappled with this as well on the podcast.
Yep.
It's a tricky balance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you've studied civilizations and women's involvement in different movements and civilizations. And as you see what's happening, kind of like if we kind of zoom out a little bit, bird's eye view, which I know is hard because we're all very involved with trying to change things on the ground. If we zoom out a little bit, my first question, like a two-pronged question. One is, how do you think this time will be discussed in history? And the second piece is, what do you feel like is missing in the movement as a whole to actually create meaningful change and as effectively and quickly as it needs to happen
Mm,
as these as we see everything kind of very scary unfold?
yeah. I love that you say the movement because it feels right now like there's a bunch of different movements happening and that they haven't formed, they haven't agreed on what the movement is. Um, I say that because I'm working with faculty on campus to put a climate crisis learning requirement in for students. Most of our classes discuss this, but we haven't formalized it. That is a hot button issue right now. Um, Talking about gender and sexuality is a hot button issue. Talking about poverty is a hot button issue. I mean, I don't think we've fully formed an idea of what the world could be like. And there's a big role for science fiction writers to play. We do a lot of thinking about what a dystopian future is, but not a whole lot of thinking about what if we get it right. So that's just a plug for Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's What If We Get It Right book, which is about climate, but it also touches on social movements. We need way more of that visualization of what would it look like if we get it right. Um, and I have some ideas about that. Articulating them as a scientist is tricky because we're not in the business of visionary thinking. We're in the business of critique and testing and incremental improvements. So there's a part of me that kind of hungers for that visionary thinking. I'll also say that I think we're moving there anyway. So we're going to look back at this moment and surviving and thriving always centers the most vulnerable folks because then you can catch the cracks and patch them more quickly. I mean, that is how it has worked for a very long time. That's the tried and true. When you centralize power and authority, you can move quickly and concentrate wealth, but you break things. You break critical things, and it doesn't work very well. So I mean, history has paid a lot of attention to lauding the accomplishments of somebody like Alexander of Macedonia, who people call Alexander the Great, right? He died in his 30s. Great what? Like, what did he do? He, burst through an ailing military empire and barely got to lead it into the next phase, and yet he occupies so much of the imagination of what is great, as opposed to thinking about or calling great a society that has lasted for a lot longer. Um, I and the other reason that I have hope is because my kids are learning a different version of civic history in school than I learned. And so pieces that are new to me now, they're just taking for granted. Like, for example, I don't know how you all were taught civics when you were in grade school, but this idea of democracy in the US has always been drawn to ancient Greek thinkers and the bedrock of democracy in Greece. But we didn't have a lot of the writing at the time to draw from ancient Greece. But what we did have was the Six Nations tribes here in North America who were practicing a thriving version of democracy, and that democracy had a structure to it where the women elders in the tribe could veto a decision, and they could also appoint the chiefs to do the representation. So I mean, it had a structure. That structure valued women, it valued motherhood, it valued equity, it centered marginalized folks. It was sustainable for a long time. It inspired the civics, modern U.S. civics, but that narrative of how this government learned about democracy and then inspired the French Revolution and changes back in Europe is not really well articulated, I don't think. So there's a lot of work to do there with re-educating ourselves and thinking about the indigenous roots to democracy here and where perhaps we copied them imperfectly, and then that created problems, and how we could tweak those civics.
Yeah.
Catherine, you brought up some really interesting things there that we have talked about before regarding, indigenous practices and ways of living that we could tap into or learn from. And around, and this sort of rounds out our conversation really beautifully because we talk a lot about imagination too, and like how can we part that has to be so important, that is important in this whole movement is and movements is imagining something different. And
Mm,
we've talked about the struggle of like how much do we look to the past and how much do we
mhm,
look to things that have existed in
mhm,
in indigenous cultures and imagine entirely new things. And I know that you think
mhm.
from your science background, you are not necessarily able to approach that, but I know that you do imagine and you do have these dream moments. Is there anything that you feel, A, that we can do as a practice to start imagining more? Or is there a vision, even just the seed of a vision that you have started to feel around how imagining a new future?
Yes, and it is based on science. So I should say too that there've been a lot of really great studies uh, around sustainability and representation, and those studies have pointed out that where there's more female leadership, you have fewer deaths from COVID, for example, or you have um, you have better water quality where you have more women people of color, people who are impacted in charge of the water supply. So there's a lot of great empiric data as well to support this, and you could boil those lessons down into three simple guidelines. One would be make sure that your representation centers the most vulnerable. And that says less about those leaders, I would say, and more about the collective community values that see the value in centering the most vulnerable. Um, when that happens, it will naturally help move toward redistributing resources to the most vulnerable so that you have more people surviving and thriving, and lead to structuring space to nudge those processes into place. And by structuring space, I mean things like desegregation, making sure that every neighborhood has parks and amenities, um, erecting statues in your local city that honor those leaders who are representing the values, making sure, things like street names also align with values. We don't think about that, but we are constantly surrounded by statues of dudes on horses who have done things in war, as opposed to, honoring mothers, honoring indigenous histories, honoring people of color, honoring immigrants, and their everything that they've brought to cities. So there's just a lot of work for the arts to do, a lot of work for each individual community member to do. But that would be the three. It would be representation, resource allocation, and structuring space. Uh, all of that means that you have to have a value system that wants everyone to thrive. And uh,
Yeah.
and that's where, again, I think, some, I don't know if it's religion or if it's just the humanitarian effort needs to very clearly articulate that as opposed to just having one group thrives because they're superior to other groups, um, is the
I love that. I think
the narrative
you
Mhm.
we're caught in.
you've done something very tough, which is provide some guidelines and thoughts that could be rooted in how people imagine a better future. I think ultimately at the end there, it almost sounded also like, and that is so that we can get to a collective liberation future. But we need some things that, and I loved it. Just it allows us to imagine a future with these things, with these changes of signs, like very, very, um, they seem sort of like practical but they can help guide people as they imagine a new future. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful way of rounding out this conversation and bringing us back to collective liberation. We covered so many topics, and they all align really beautifully with many conversations we've been having. And Catherine, you brought some really great new perspectives to it when we're always talking about wanting to learn and learn in public, and you've allowed us to do that. So thank you. Hannah, do you have anything else you want to ask Catherine?
No, I'm super grateful. I would love to kind of keep some of these conversations going because you touched on so many different things, and I'm like, ooh, I would love to dig in deeper with that. You're just a wealth of knowledge. You are a perspective that is very fresh, and you've said so many things today that I've never heard before, which is always
Oh, fun.
exciting for me. So thank you so much for that. And Deema, anything else?
Nope. Catherine, how about you? Any last words you'd
Well,
like to have on the show?
yeah.
And then we do want to bring you back, so this will not be the last time we'll be hearing from you.
Well, I just want to thank you both for dedicating your time and effort to knowledge sharing. That is no small thing either, and for being willing to be vulnerable and put yourselves in a learning position to model that for everyone else is powerful. So thank you.